Good morning, everyone. This is Kathy Randall, and welcome to the March Q&A call. And I'm excited today to talk about with everyone aEEG and cooling. So we have just a couple people on the line, and so I just want to welcome them and then welcome all of you who are listening to the recording later. And I'm going to invite the people who are on the line, if they'd like to unmute themselves or to text in any questions that you had. I prepared a couple slides just in case there weren't any burning questions, but I just open it up to you both. No? I'm not sure if maybe just your audio. So if you have specific questions, go ahead and put them in the chat area. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll just run through these few little slides that I put together and see if at any point that stimulates some additional conversation or questions. So probably if you've seen any of my teachings before, I oftentimes talk about these 6 S's or 6 items that we should always look at when we're interpreting aEEG. And I think for cooling specifically, it goes really well to actually all of these pieces. So the 6 S's are looking at the infant story. Then we want to look at the background activity or the strength of the brain. We want to look at sleep-wake patterns, symmetry between the right and the left, so looking for unilateral injuries. We want to look for stability, but really more importantly for our cooling babies, we're actually looking for improvement and change over time, because oftentimes they start out more depressed. And then, of course, for cooling kids, we are looking at seizures, since we know that about 80% of their seizures are going to be subclinical. So I think just kind of as a reminder, these are the 6 S's that we should always be looking at, but specifically for cooling kids, there are some individual things that we want to look at in a little more detail. So just as a reminder, there are basically 5 patterns. I always like to, especially if you're teaching others about aEEG in your division, it's always good to just remind people how simple aEEG really is. That there is really only 5 patterns. 1 is normal for term babies, 1 is normal for preterm babies, and the other 3 are not normal for anyone at any age, even you and I as adults. These are not normal tracings for us at any time of life. So the 5 patterns, we're all aware of them and very familiar with their names and probably very familiar with the way that they look, even without the voltage limits on these pictures. Excuse me. We're all pretty familiar with them. So just as a reminder, there's just 5. And so what I like to do when I'm first teaching, especially nurses, to be learning how to interpret aEEG is just to really always think, number 1, at that baby's story, because that's going to help inform you about what you expect to see. And so we always should go, looking at our aEEGs about thinking about what do I expect or intend to learn from this tracing. And if you're the physician, why did you order it? And why are you looking at it now? So I think that it's always really a good idea to be having those things in mind. So and when we think about the baby's history, we can think of their long-term history for as long, maybe their gestation. How long is their gestation? What's their gestational age? What is their now chronological age? But really, what was their OB history, depending on, how far away or how close that was to when you're monitoring them. Whether or not you're cooling, what stage of cooling you're in, and then what medications have they recently received. And so usually we're thinking about things that they've received sometime in the last hour. But when we look at injured brains, sometimes because of the ability for the body to clear those medications, it can be even up to 24 hours ago that they've received medications. So I think it's important to always look back at what's been ordered, what's been given, and kind of use that in context of what you're seeing on the monitor. Because certainly we know some medications are going to suppress the brain. And so then it's going to inform us about whether or not we think that's injury or is that a result of medication. So I think, again, just kind of looking at what's expected. And then if that doesn't match up, then starting to think of reasons why that might not match up. So just as a little kind of further detail about thinking about the patterns that we see, the effect of injury, so especially today talking about kind of the impact of cooling in HIE, what are the kinds of patterns that we see with HIE typically? And then, of course, just as just kind of an add-on, kind of gestational age, what are some of the things that we oftentimes see from a gestational age point of view related to these background patterns? So if we see continuous normal voltage, there's either no injury or extremely little injury. Of course, if babies are older in gestation, we might see continuous normal voltage as well. Discontinuous for a term baby. So of course, when we're talking typically about HIE, we're talking about term babies. So in this case, we're thinking about a discontinuous pattern is not what we would typically expect for a term baby. And so whether that's an indication of mild injury or even potentially some effect of medication or sedation that we've given that is maybe explaining why we see discontinuous. Then, of course, burst suppression, especially if it's really transient, maybe only lasting a few hours, might be indicative of a mild injury. Certainly, if it persists, it should be severe, not severe injury, especially if it persists. And then, of course, continuous low voltage just always being an indication of severe injury, especially in a term baby, as opposed to really a fetus. As you can see in early second trimester, they may have a continuous low voltage as kind of a typical expression of a extremely fetal EEG. So again, just kind of thinking about that they're, depending on the level of HIE, maybe depending on the Sarnot score, you may expect to see some of these things. Of course, we always hope to see something better to give us a better prognosis. But again, these are things we might expect if we do have aEEG on a kid who's with HIE. So this is just a slide sometimes I show, just again saying kind of for term babies, really only the green or good is that continuous normal voltage, as opposed to our preterm babies where really we expect them to probably have a discontinuous trace to some degree. If their gestational age is approaching more of a term baby, we expect to see them continuous normal voltage. Burst suppression like looking patterns for our extremely premature babies, 22, 23 weekers, and of course really never normal to see a viable infant having a low voltage or in an active trace. So I thought in just kind of prompting some of the discussion is kind of looking back at kind of why do we like aEEG for kids with HIE, and this is a pretty classic study. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a little bit kind of out of date now that we're in this cooling era. But really, this is kind of going back to Cherhoff and their group, and this was published in 2004. And it's a very busy slide, so I'll walk you through it if you've never seen it before. It's actually one of my favorite research graphs. But basically, the way that I read this and the way that it was originally described to me, on the left-hand axis, you see that those are the actual patient number. And then on the bottom scale is time. So just to kind of orient you to that these are individual patients, and this is a time scale for their aEEGs over time. And these are infants who were born with HIE. And this was, again, early 2000s. These infants were not being cooled. And what they did is they broke them into groups of babies who had normal outcomes, mild to mildly abnormal outcomes, and then extremely abnormal outcomes and death. So you see that on the far right-hand side. And then they color-coded their aEEGs to just show the progression of aEEG over time. And so we can look at the kind of the blue colors are the continuous normal voltage. The purple would be if they had sleep. The green is if they had discontinuous tracing. And if it's superimposed with any kind of checkerboard pattern, that meant that they had epileptic activity, any kind of seizure at all. Yellow is burst suppression, and then the orange is continuous low voltage, and the red is flat. So if we look just at the normal section, the babies who had normal outcomes, so that's going to be those babies that are from number 28 and below, you see them kind of sprinkled there. You can see that for the most part, they are all kind of sitting in this green and blue zone. We have a couple babies who started out number 22, I think it is, or right above number 22, who started out as red, flat tracing. That was right around 6 hours of age. Then you can see quickly transitioning into continuous low voltage and then switch to discontinuous pretty quickly. Then we can look at others where they kind of vacillate, the one that's on the very, very bottom, number 3, where it started out as burst suppression, went to discontinuous, back to burst suppression, discontinuous, and then back to a continuous normal voltage trace. So a very kind of, cool, I really enjoy looking at it this way, this way to see that for the most part, kiddos who have a normal outcome are actually those kids who had either a brief time sitting in those abnormal traces, but for the most part, we're sitting somewhere in our discontinuous or our continuous normal voltage patterns. Then we move up to the mildly abnormal section, and those are babies who had mild outcomes, and I believe it's 18 or 24 months outcomes they looked at. And these kids, you can see also kind of, some of them actually, had pretty normal traces right from the beginning, which is always disturbing, right? Because those are the kids that we don't expect. You can see that baby number 19 had a normal trace, and there's a gap. And then you can see at almost 72 hours started having seizures. So again, that's kind of an interesting one where they didn't monitor, but maybe he started showing clinical signs. So they remonitored and then they saw seizures. That's that green one where you see the gap, and then the other recording there right at 72 hours. Then you see the others, kind of again, similar to our healthier kids, where they went through these periods of kind of low voltage, then burst suppression, interspersed with a few seizures, and then you see kind of returning to a discontinuous trace, which we would expect. And then we look at our abnormal babies on this particular graph, and you see that they are primarily the babies who are having the continuous low voltage tracing, they're having flat tracings, a lot of burst suppression, and probably most notably, you'll see all of these babies many of these babies having some sort of seizure activity as well, which again really tells me that we need to be monitoring these kids continuously, because there's just so high risk for the ones who are going to have the worst outcomes are going to be the ones who have this really high seizure burden. So again, this is pre-cooling. So many people still wonder, what do we do now that we're in this cooling era, and do these numbers really, do they really fly? So you can see that the kids who did the best had a return of kind of a normal pattern, somewhere around 24 to 36 hours. So that used to be our cutoff. We used to say, these kids need to, by 36 hours, have a better tracing, or we're going to have more suspicion for long-term issues. So probably all of you are then aware of kind of the follow-up that Mariana Sorensen, Lena Hellstrom-Westis, Linda DeVries, and others did, looking and seeing at whether or not this time to return to normal trace was still accurate when we looked at kids who had been cooled. So have all of you seen this before? So I was going to just go over it really briefly if you haven't. But it really does say that time to normal trace continues to be a strong predictor. But the little asterisk or the little caveat to that is now we give them until 48 hours. So we wait those first 2 days of cooling, then we really hope to see a return of normal pattern. If we don't, then we continue to have a higher level of suspicion. So this is a published article, or an article that was published in Pediatrics in 2010, in July of 2010. If you haven't read through the whole length of it, it's really a great article. But basically, in this graph in particular, basically what I'll do is just kind of walk you through it. The red babies were the normal thermic babies. Those are the babies who were not cooled. So these were babies that were in the TOBY trial. So they had controls and they had cooled babies. So then they looked at those babies and compared their aEEGs. So we can see that the red babies are the not cooled, and then the blue icons are the babies who were cooled. Babies who had a normal outcome have an open shape, And the babies who have poor outcome have a filled-in shape, so either a filled-in triangle or a filled-in circle, so a solid circle or a solid triangle. And then the babies who died actually are the stars. So you can see if we just look at the babies who were cooled and who had normal outcomes, you can see the cluster there. They're mostly down there by the 0 to 6. Then we've got a few at 12 hours, a few more at 18 hours, a few more at 24 hours, a few more at 36, and the last being at 48 hours. We see the babies who had poor outcome. Some did recover by 24, only a few, so that we've got one at 24, one at 36, one at 48. And then we've got a couple that are there at 60 hours, a couple who never regain, and a couple, and then a handful who die. When we look at the normothermic kids, we see, again, very similar, that the kids who had the normal outcome clustering there before 24 hours, the others kind of sprinkled throughout, and then later we see those who either regained late or never passing away. So again, it is still relevant to look at background. We also can look at, sorry, I'll go to this one. Looking at the effect of background. Again, this is just kind of tracing it out for your predictive value, and looking that for our cooled babies, we don't really see that same power that we used to see with our normothermic kids. You can see that the predictive value stays above 0.8 for our non-cooled normothermic kids, all the way along from 3 to 6 hours, all the way out through 72. For our cooling babies, the predictive value is not there until we get past 36 hours. So again, we need to wait all the way, and really that 48 hours is really where we match back up to those that full predictive value. So I think just as a recap, I think it's important when we're talking about cooling babies and when we're teaching bedside staff, it's important to think about not only what is normal for age, but what's expected based on some of the other history things that we've just talked about. And one of the primary things that when I'm teaching bedside staff, it's one of the things that I focus on the most. So I hope that was helpful. It's just a little overview and just a few little talking points about cooling in aEEG. But are there any specific questions that you guys would like to discuss? You can go ahead if you want to either unmute yourself, you can, or if you want to just type a question, feel free. Anything? Well, I guess if there are no questions, we can wrap up for this month. I'll go ahead and post this on the forum, and hopefully it would generate some additional questions. I know, Gabriel, I thank you so much for always being on the forum and posting questions, and I encourage so many more of you to do the same and to interact amongst each other, to be supportive in your journey of using aEEG, and continuing to be the disciples in your own units of aEEG and its phenomenal use. Something I didn't mention that maybe we can discuss in the forum a little bit more is who's using EEG only and who's using aEEG during cooling. I think that's always an important discussion, and I don't know if you want to type in what you're doing. Oh, sorry, I'm seeing here. The questions were down. What do I think of the subclassification of discontinuous low and discontinuous high? It's usually used for the preterms. This is correct. Absolutely. So I apologize. I see now that these were just not scrolling. So yeah, so there is a subclassification. It was, I think, published by Clever Moss and Olashar. And I like it. I think it is informative, especially in the preterm babies. It really does speak to the amount of discontinuity. And I think that there probably is some degree of that we see in cooling kids as well. Really kind of trying to draw that fine line between how low is low and, how much higher is their high. And probably in cooling, we probably see a split similar to prematurity of, probably some acuity. We probably do see some differences. But I think primarily its usefulness has been mostly looked at for preterm babies. There's a question about whether or not aEEG should be used as an indication for cooling. This is a great question, actually. I think that aEEG in and of itself is a helpful tool for us during cooling. My personal opinion about it is that we used aEEG as a qualification when we were trying to figure out which kids were the sickest, when we didn't know whether or not cooling was safe. I don't know that, based on the NICHD, the body cooling trials that didn't use aEEG as a qualification, we still see a favorable benefit. So I think that without using aEEG, I think we should monitor, for sure. I think we should monitor. But I think to not cool a child who clinically meets criteria because the aEEG isn't fully showing the extent of injury, I think we may miss a few kids. There's also always the chance that there may be some sort of artifact that is unidentified that makes the pattern look more normal. And then I worry about those kids that end up crashing or turning into a worse clinical scenario around 8 or 10, 12 hours, and that now we've not cooled, and now they're in status. So I think that because we know there is such a benefit to cooling, that I don't think that we need to use aEEG anymore as a single rule in, rule out. But I think in the beginning, when we didn't know its safety, I feel like aEEG was a really smart way for us to choose infants with the most potential for benefiting. But I don't know that it's really relevant anymore. So you also ask about a great question as well. So according to this paper, and I'm going to go back here. So actually, the normal trace defined in this particular article, and as well as Ter Horst, was discontinuous. So they can, even though it is not an expected pattern for an infant of that age, because of the injury, they allowed discontinuous normal voltage. So probably, again, back to your question about high discontinuous, it was probably those high discontinuous patterns versus the low discontinuous patterns. So I'd have to go back and look at it exactly, but for this study, I remember there is a page where they kind of considered normal to be both discontinuous and continuous normal voltage. And I think that great, you guys are using EEG as well. I think that these new devices that can do both EEG, full EEG with access for our neurologists, and aEEG trending for the bedside staff are really the best of both worlds. As happens in the States, usually when we have full continuous EEG, it's only continuously recording. It's not being continuously reviewed. And I think that with aEEG, and especially during HIE, that we want to have that continuous review by the bedside team, and we don't want to miss out on that opportunity to intervene more quickly and to recognize these very subtle improvements that we might see in our kids around that 24 to 36 hours. The trend is is so powerful and so easy to use. And I think that our neurology colleagues, as they begin to see that value, will really enjoy using the trend, and then have the benefit of also being able to look at the details of the EEG for other subtle findings for prognosis. But for trend and prediction of normality, I think that having the trend at the bedside is so important. Looks like Gabriel is just mentioning that. Thank you. I'm glad you agree. I always wonder if I'm out there by myself thinking these things. You're using aEEG and EEG for all babies with HIE preterm, which will below 31. That's great. And babies with congenital heart disease. Yeah, they're. Oh, great. I love that your neurophysiologists love aEEG. This is fantastic. Yeah, it's such a simple, powerful tool. I wish everyone would embrace it as much as both of you. Are you using, Gabriel, are you using hydrogels for your preemies? Or are you using needles? Needles. So even for the small ones. Do you find the staff are quite keen for using the needles for the littlest ones as well? We find a lot of resistance here for needles in our small preemies. Most people will use the hydrogels for that size baby. I know there's a cardiologist very interested in aEEG at Loma Linda here in California, and she's doing a study of babies with congenital heart disease as well. So she might be someone to pair you up with at some point. Oh, so for your very, very small ones, back to the needle question, Gabriel's commenting that they use the gold caps for the very small preemies, and then needles for maybe the older preterm. Great. Fantastic. Any other, now that I've caught up on your chat, I'm so sorry I missed all that on the side. Yes, the impedance being very low in preemies, yeah. Any other questions about aEEG and cooling today? Again, I just encourage everyone who's listening, who didn't come on live, to really participate in the forum and to get more engaged there and just really chat to each other. Yeah, I think so. Gabriel's little final point here is, I think every baby with high risk for brain injury should be monitored as we measure oximetry for the body and other organs. I couldn't agree more. I think there's just so much to learn by just putting on these couple of electrodes. Of course, there are limitations. We all acknowledge some of those limitations, but certainly in the case of babies with HIE, there's a lot of benefit to being able to see what's happening inside when their clinical presentation is just still so obscured by their disease, by medication. I think having the aEEG there can really reassure us to whether or not what we see is matching what's happening in the brain and help us to direct. So thank you everyone for coming, and we will definitely be here again next month. And again, in the meantime, encourage you to just stay connected on Facebook and through our forum online. So thank you so much. Have an excellent day wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much to Anita for joining us from Singapore and Gabriel from Brazil. And I'll sign off from the US here, and have a great good night. Talk to you all very soon. Bye.